For the first 3 years of the war, the North Atlantic night belonged to the U-boat. It was a simple rhythm of survival. During the day, the gray wolves would hide deep beneath the waves, submerged and blind, waiting out the Allied destroyers. But when the sun set, they would rise. The cover of darkness was their shield. On the surface, they could run their diesel engines, recharge their batteries, and travel faster than any convoy. The surface was their sanctuary. It was where they breathed, where they smoked cigarettes on the conning tower, and where they hunted. But in the spring of 1943, the sanctuary turned into a slaughterhouse. The change didn't happen gradually, it happened with terrifying suddenness. Veteran U-boat commanders, men with iron crosses around their necks, who had survived the worst storms and depth charge attacks, began to vanish without a trace. They weren't signaling distress, they weren't reporting convoys, they were simply disappearing into the black water. For the crews that survived to tell the tale, the story was always the same, and it was impossible. They would be surfacing in the Bay of Biscay, the crucial transit route from their bases in France to the open Atlantic. The night would be pitch black, perhaps with heavy cloud cover or thick fog, perfect U-boat weather. On the bridge, the lookouts would strain their eyes against the salt spray. Down below, the radio operator, the Funkmatt, would be listening intently to his Metox receiver. The Metox was their guardian angel. It was a radar detector connected to a crude wooden cross-shaped antenna, famously nicknamed the Biscay Cross. If an Allied plane was hunting them with radar, the Metox would pick up the ping long before the plane got close. It gave the U-boat ample time to crash dive and hide. The operator would report, "No signals, the sky is clear." The captain would relax. The crew would fill their lungs with fresh air. They were safe in the cloak of invisibility. And then the impossible would happen. There would be no warning ping, no hum of an approaching engine, just an instantaneous blinding explosion of light. A million's candle power searchlight, known as the Lee light, would ignite from the clouds less than a mile away, turning the dark ocean into a blinding white stage. Before the captain could even scream "Alarm!", the roar of 4 engines would deafen them. An Allied Liberator or Wellington bomber would descend from the darkness like a dragon. Depth charges would straddle the boat before the hatch could even be secured. Those who survived were fished out of the oil-slicked water in shock. They all asked the same question: how did they find us? The panic traveled all the way up the chain of command to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz in his headquarters near Paris. The reports on his desk were terrifying. U-boats were being destroyed in conditions of zero visibility. They were being targeted with pinpoint accuracy in pitch darkness. But the Metox detectors were silent. Dönitz and his staff were men of science and logic, but this defied physics. If the British were using radar, the Metox should hear it. If they weren't using radar, they shouldn't be able to see a gray submarine in a black ocean. Paranoia began to fester in the German high command. They didn't blame technology, they blamed people. They became convinced that there was a traitor in their midst. They suspected that the British had developed a network of spies in the French ports who were radioing the departure times of the U-boats. They suspected the French resistance. They even suspected that the Enigma code had been broken, which it had, but that didn't explain the tactical precision of the attacks. They checked the equipment again. The engineers insisted the Metox was working perfectly. This was the invisible death. The German crews began to look at the sky with dread. They felt naked. The psychological weight was crushing. They were fighting an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy that could see them through clouds, through rain, and through the darkest night. The ocean, once their hunting ground, had become a trap. The gray wolves were no longer the predators. They were the prey, being picked off one by an invisible eye in the sky, and they had absolutely no idea how it was happening. To the crew of a U-boat in early 1943, the most important piece of equipment on board was not the torpedoes, nor the diesel engines, nor even the Enigma machine. It was a crude, ugly contraption made of wood and wire that they bolted to the conning tower every time they surfaced. They called it the Biscay Cross. Technically, it was the antenna for the Metox radar detector. For months, it had been their talisman against death. The logic of the war was simple. The British planes used radar to find U-boats, but radar sends out radio waves. If the U-boat could hear those waves hitting them before the reflection went back to the plane, they had a warning. The Metox was that warning. When it picked up the pulse of a British patrol plane, it would scream a high-pitched beep, beep, beep into the radio operator's headphones. It usually gave the captain 20 minutes of grace, plenty of time to clear the bridge, seal the hatch, and dive into the safety of the deep. The German crews trusted the Metox with their lives. They believed it was infallible. But in the science labs of England, the Allies had changed the rules of physics, and they hadn't told the Germans. While the Metox was listening intently for the long 1.5-meter wavelengths that the British had used since 1940, the Allied scientists had secretly deployed the cavity magnetron. This device produced radar beams that were infinitely smaller, just 10 centimeters long. These new centimetric waves were tight, focused, and incredibly powerful. But most importantly, to the Metox receiver, they were invisible. They were on a frequency that the German equipment simply could not hear. The result was a tragedy played out in the dark, night after night. Imagine the scene on U-564 or U-107. The boat is surfacing to recharge batteries. The air is heavy with the smell of diesel and salt. On the bridge, 4 lookouts are scanning the horizon with binoculars, their eyes stinging from the wind. Down in the radio room, the funkmat sits hunched over the Metox set. He is the most anxious man on the boat. He turns the dial, straining to hear the telltale beep of an enemy radar. He hears nothing, just the hiss of static, the cosmic noise of the universe. "No signals," he reports to the bridge. "The sky is clean." The captain relaxes. The crew light cigarettes. They believe they are alone in the empty ocean. But 5 miles away, flying just above the wavetops, is a British Wellington bomber. Inside its fuselage, a radar operator is looking at a glowing green screen. He sees a distinct, bright blip in the center of the clutter. It is the U-boat. The new centimetric radar is painting the submarine with invisible energy, bouncing off the steel hull and returning a perfect targeting solution. The bomber pilot adjusts his course. He drops lower. He lines up the attack. The radar is screaming at the submarine, bathing it in electromagnetic radiation. But on the U-boat, the Metox remains silent. The Biscay Cross stands uselessly on the bridge, a deaf ear turned to a screaming sky. The first warning the Germans get is not a beep in a headphone. It is the sudden, terrifying roar of aircraft engines directly overhead. It is the blinding flash of the lee light, turning the night into day. It is the splash of depth charges hitting the water before the alarm bell can even ring. As the explosions tear the pressure hull apart, the crew dies with a look of total confusion on their faces. They had done everything right. They had listened. The machine had promised them they were safe. The failure of the Biscay Cross created a paranoia that was almost as destructive as the bombs themselves. The German High Command, unable to explain why their boats were being surprised, began to blame the equipment in the wrong way. They developed a theory that the Metox itself was sending out a signal that the British were homing in on. In a panic, Grand Admiral Donitz ordered his captains to turn the Metox off. It was a fatal error. By turning off their only, albeit flawed, warning system, the U-boats were now truly blind. They had been trapped by their own reliance on outdated technology. The Biscay Cross, once their savior, had become a tombstone, a wooden symbol of a technological war they had already lost without even knowing the battle had begun. The Rotterdam Extraction. Classified File 88 Beta. Date November 14th, 1998. Location Port of Rotterdam, Walhaven Terminal 4. The rain in Rotterdam doesn't wash things clean. It just makes the grime slicker. I remember the smell of ozone overpowering the scent of diesel and rotting sea kelp that night. We were officially there for a counter-narcotics operation, a standard intercept of a container coming in from a heavy freighter docked out of Murmansk. But the moment we stepped onto the wet asphalt of Terminal 4, we knew the briefing was a lie. My name is Sergeant Elias Thorne, 1st Special Recovery Unit. I'm speaking now because the statute of limitations on my silence is effectively meaningless, given what my team saw. The target was a rusted, nondescript shipping container, number MSCU 492201. It sat alone in a quarantine zone, isolated by Dutch port authorities who had suddenly fallen ill an hour prior. Intelligence called it the Rotterdam Device, but to us it was just the package. Our Geiger counters were silent, yet the hair on my arm stood straight up as we approached. There was a sound, not heard but felt, a low-frequency thrum that rattled your teeth and made your vision blur at the edges. "Cut the seal," Captain Miller ordered. His voice cracked over the comms, distorted by a static interference that shouldn't have existed on encrypted channels. Private Jensen moved in with the thermal torch. As the flame touched the locking mechanism, the metal didn't melt, it screamed. It was a high-pitched shriek, like twisting glass. When the doors swung open, the rain seemed to stop falling around us, suspended in midair by a localized gravitational anomaly. Inside, there was no packing straw, no crates. Suspended in the center of the dark steel box was the device. It was roughly the size of a car engine, shaped like a dodecahedron, but the geometry was wrong. It shifted when you looked at it directly, crafted from a material that looked like obsidian, but pulsed with a faint rhythmic violet vein. It wasn't mechanics, it was biology fused with alloy. "Secure it, now!" Miller yelled, though he was backing away. We moved to attach the mag clamps. That's when it activated. The violet light flared, blindingly bright. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, a metallic taste flooding my mouth, the taste of radiation or something worse. Jensen, who was closest, didn't scream, he just froze. We watched as the shadows around him elongated and detached themselves from the floor, wrapping around his legs. The device was pulling energy from the environment, draining the floodlights, the truck batteries, even the heat from our bodies. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a second. We had to manually drag the containment cage over it. It felt like pushing against a magnetic wall. Every inch was a fight against a force that wanted to repel us, a force that felt undeniably hostile. When the lead-lined lid finally slammed shut, the suspension of the rain broke. Water crashed down on us, instant and heavy. Jensen collapsed, bleeding from his nose and ears, muttering numbers that didn't correspond to any coordinates on Earth. We loaded it onto the unmarked transport within 4 minutes. By the time the Dutch police arrived, we were a ghost story, just tire tracks and a lingering electromagnetic signature that would confuse their instruments for decades. We were told it was a Soviet prototype. We were told to forget the suspension of gravity and the living geometry. But I know what I touched. I know that when we drove away, the hum didn't stop. It wasn't a machine we recovered in Rotterdam. It was a dormant survivor, and we just woke it up. The cargo that saved the world.
Date: September 19th, 1940. Location: the Wardman Park Hotel, Washington, D.C. The Loomis Laboratory, Tuxedo Park. Dr. Robert Holloway, Microwave Committee Liaison. The history books will tell you the war was won on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over Midway, but I was there in a dim hotel room in Washington, D.C. when the war was actually won. It happened on a Thursday evening inside a wooden box the size of a carry-on suitcase. We called it the Tizard Mission. Britain was bleeding. The Luftwaffe was pounding London into rubble every night, and the Royal Air Force was fighting blind. They had radar, yes, the chain home system, but it was massive, stationary, and operated on long wavelengths. It could see a formation of planes from miles away, but it couldn't pinpoint a single bomber in the dark. It couldn't fit inside a cockpit. When the British delegation arrived, they were exhausted. They looked like men who had been running a marathon while holding their breath. Edward Taffy Bowen, a Welsh physicist with eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep, held the box. He didn't let a porter touch it. He didn't let the hotel staff near it. We were skeptical. The American military establishment in 1940 was arrogant. We thought we were leading the world in microwave research. We had klystrons that could generate maybe 10 watts of power at a 10-centimeter wavelength. We thought we were on the cutting edge. We were wrong. We were barely in the Stone Age. Bowen placed the box on the mahogany table. The air in the room was thick with cigar smoke and skepticism. He unlocked the clasps. Inside, nestled in velvet, sat a peculiar object. It didn't look like a weapon. It looked like a piece of industrial plumbing or a strange motorcycle part. It was a block of copper, circular, about the size of a double cheeseburger, with cooling fins and glass protruding from the center. "Gentlemen," Bowen said, his voice quiet but steady, "this is the resonant cavity magnetron, number 12. One of our senior engineers scoffed. That's your miracle? It's too small to handle the heat dissipation for anything useful." Bowen didn't argue. He just smiled, a grim, tired smile. "We've measured it at 10 kilowatts pulsed output." The room went silent. Someone laughed nervously. "10 watts, you mean, Dr. Bowen? Surely you mean 10 watts." 10 kilowatts, Bowen corrected, at 10 centimeters. It was a physical impossibility, or so we thought. If he was telling the truth, that little copper puck was 1,000 times more powerful than the most advanced transmitter in the United States. It was the difference between a flashlight and a searchlight. We took it to the lab at Tuxedo Park for verification. The tension was palpable. Alfred Loomis, the financier and physicist running the show, was trembling. If this was a hoax, it was a cruel one. If it was real, the balance of power had just shifted. We hooked it up. The cathode heated. The magnets were aligned. We threw the switch. I will never forget the sound. It wasn't a hum. It was a roar of energy, a bite of power that practically vibrated the floorboards. The needles on our measurement instruments didn't just move. They slammed against the maximum stops and bent. We weren't looking at 10 kilowatts. As we refined the tuning, the output climbed. 15, 20. It eventually hit 100 kilowatts. I looked at Loomis. His face had gone pale. We were staring at a device small enough to fit in the nose of a night fighter plane, yet powerful enough to spot a German U-boat periscope from 5 miles away through dense fog. This was the centimetric shock. In that instant, every American radar project became obsolete. The British hadn't just brought us a gadget, they had brought us the ability to see in the dark. We realized then why Bowen had guarded that box with his life. It contained the death of the U-boat wolf packs. It contained the proximity fuse. It contained the precision bombing of Berlin. As the device hummed, cooling down from the test, Bowen lit a cigarette. He looked at the stunned American faces around the room, illuminated by the glow of the oscilloscopes. "Now," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke, "can you mass-produce it?" We did, and that is how we saved the world.
May 24th, 1943. Location: U-Boat High Command, BDU, Berlin-Charlottenburg, the North Atlantic. The panic at the headquarters of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz didn't start with a scream. It started with silence. For 3 years, the German Grey Wolves, the U-boat fleet, had strangled Great Britain. We were the apex predators of the Atlantic. We hunted in packs, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping. We were winning. We had the Atlantic Gap, the black pit where Allied air cover couldn't reach us. And we had our ears, the Metox receivers. I was a communications officer at the BDU. My job was to track the packs. In 1942, the mood was electric, but by the spring of 1943, the mood had turned to ice. In the first 3 weeks of May alone, we didn't just lose a few boats, we lost 31. The reports coming in were terrified and confusing. U-boat commanders, men of iron nerve, were radioing in hysteria before going silent forever. They all said the same thing. They came out of nowhere. You see, a U-boat is vulnerable. It has to surface at night to recharge its batteries using diesel engines. We felt safe in the dark. We had the Metox device, a radar detector. If an Allied plane was hunting us with radar, the Metox would beep, giving us ample time to crash dive before they found us. But in May 1943, the Metox stopped beeping. One survivor's report changed everything. It came from U-569. The commander described surfacing on a pitch-black night, miles from any convoy. The sea was calm. The Metox was silent. The crew was smoking on the conning tower, relaxed. Suddenly, the night turned into day. A blinding white light, a lee light, snapped on from the sky, less than a mile away. It was attached to a B-24 Liberator bomber. There was no warning, no radar pulse detected, just sudden blinding illumination, followed seconds later by depth charges straddling the hull. The Admiral paced the map room, his face gray. He looked at the pins on the map, each one a lost crew, disappearing at a rate that was mathematically impossible to sustain. "They are seeing us in the dark," Dönitz muttered. "They are seeing us without looking." The panic in the staff was not about cowardice, it was about technological inferiority. We realized too late that the Allies had changed the rules of physics. We were listening for long-wave radar signals, 1.5 meters, but the Allies had deployed the H-2S radar system, powered by the cavity magnetron. They were using centimetric waves, 10 centimeters. These waves were too short for our Metox receivers to detect. They were invisible to us, but they painted a picture of the ocean surface for the Allied pilots with terrifying clarity. They could spot a periscope from 5 miles away through dense cloud and fog. We were no longer hunters. We were targets painted in neon in a dark room, and we didn't even know we were glowing. On May 24th, the panic solidified into a grim acceptance. Dönitz looked at the staggering losses, 41 submarines destroyed in a single month. The tonnage war was lost. The hunters had become the hunted. He turned to me and gave the order that ended the Battle of the Atlantic. "Withdraw them," he said, his voice hollow. "Withdraw the wolf packs. We cannot fight what we cannot see." The ocean was empty again. The lifeline to Britain was open. The small copper block, the magnetron,
had done what entire navies could not. It had broken the back of the Kriegsmarine.